I never imagined a cup of coffee on a quiet morning would change the way I saw myself. At 66, I had grown used to the silence, the steady, reliable hush of a house that no longer echoed with children's laughter or the soft footsteps of a man I used to share a bed with. My husband passed away nearly 5 years ago, and though the ache of that loss had dulled over time, something else had taken its place, a kind of invisibility. I wasn't unhappy, not exactly, but I had stopped feeling like I was part of anything. The world moved on, faster every year, and I had stepped aside, watching it rush past from the safety of my porch swing. The neighborhood had changed too. Young families moved in, their children racing down the sidewalks I once paced with strollers. The woman across the street ran a yoga class from her living room. The man next door installed solar panels. And the house to my right, the one with the peeling shutters and creaky porch steps, had finally been sold after sitting empty for 2 years. He moved in quietly. No grand trucks or welcome parties, just a silver sedan, a handful of cardboard boxes, and a man who looked to be in his early 70s, with a cautious smile and tired eyes. His name was Walter. We didn't speak at first. He nodded at me from time to time when we crossed paths, taking out the trash or collecting the mail. I assumed he was a widower like me, though I never asked. There was something guarded in the way he carried himself, as if he was used to being left alone. One morning, I was watering the ferns on my porch when I noticed him struggling with something heavy in the back of his car. I should have looked away. I usually did. But something about the way he paused, his back arched in silent pain, made me set down the hose and walk across the lawn. "Need a hand?" I asked, already reaching for the other side of the box. He looked surprised, not by the offer, but maybe by the fact that I meant it. He hesitated, then stepped aside, letting me help. The box wasn't light, full of old books, I guessed, by the weight and the soft thud it made when we set it down in the front room. "Thank you," he said. His voice was quiet, but kind. I wasn't sure anyone still did things like that. I smiled. "We do. Sometimes." That was the beginning. He invited me in for coffee that day. I almost declined. It had been so long since someone asked. But something in me stirred. Not excitement exactly. More like curiosity. A part of me that hadn't been spoken to in years. His home smelled of old wood and dust and something else, perhaps cinnamon. The furniture was modest, worn in the way that tells you someone had lived many lives in the same skin. We sat at his kitchen table, a kind with one uneven leg, sipping instant coffee from mismatched mugs. He didn't ask me about my husband or my children. He asked if I liked music, if I still danced, if I remembered the first book that made me cry. It was so unexpected to be asked about who I was, not what I had done. That morning passed quietly, and when I returned home, the silence felt different. Not heavier, but fuller somehow, as if it had been stirred. I told myself it was nothing, just 2 neighbors, filling space. But I kept thinking about the questions he asked, about the look in his eyes when I said I hadn't danced in decades. And deep down, I knew something had shifted. Not between us, but inside me. And that's where the real change always begins. After that first morning, I found myself looking for Walter more than I cared to admit. Not in an obvious way. I didn't linger by the window or invent excuses to be outside. But I did slow my walks past his porch. I watered my flowers a little longer. I noticed when his car was gone and when it returned. A few days passed before we spoke again. It was a late afternoon, kind where the sun turns everything golden. I was returning from the mailbox when I saw him sitting on his porch with a book in his lap and a blanket draped over his knees. He looked up, saw me, and offered a small wave. I hesitated, then turned toward him. Good book? I asked. He held up the cover. An old mystery novel I had read years ago. Comfort reading, he said. Sometimes it's not about the ending. It's about remembering how it made you feel the first time. I nodded. I knew exactly what he meant. Want to join me? I have tea. He lifted a second mug from the little table beside him. There was no reason to say yes. And yet, I did. The porch creaked as I sat down beside him. The tea was a little too strong. The mug chipped on one side. But it was warm, and the air smelled like lilacs. And for the first time in a while, I didn't feel like a background character in someone else's life. We didn't speak much that evening, just shared the quiet. And when I finally stood to leave, he touched my arm gently and said, "Thank you for sitting." It was such a simple thing. But I felt it all the way down to my bones. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror longer than usual. I studied my face, the fine lines, the softness under my jaw, the eyes that once danced more often. I didn't feel beautiful, but I didn't feel invisible either. I remembered what Walter had asked me that first morning, if I still danced. I hadn't thought of it in years. But now the memory returned, vivid and strange. A younger version of me, barefoot in the kitchen, twirling to an old record while my children clapped along. Somewhere along the way, I had packed that part of myself away. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe it wasn't too late to open the box again. The next morning, I baked banana bread. Not for anyone, not with a plan. Just because I used to love the way it made the house smell. When it cooled, I cut 2 thick slices, wrapped them in parchment, and walked across the lawn. Walter answered on the third knock. "I brought breakfast," I said, holding out the bundle. He looked surprised, then quietly pleased. "Come in." We ate in the same kitchen, with the uneven table leg and mismatched mugs. We talked more that day, about books, about loss, about the strange stillness that follows after a big life ends. He told me about his wife, who had passed 2 years earlier, about how he'd stopped listening to music after she was gone, because it reminded him too much of her humming in the mornings. "Do you ever miss the noise?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Sometimes I miss the version of me that existed when she was still here." I knew exactly what he meant. When I left, he walked me to the door and said, quietly, "You can come by any time, Evelyn." And though it wasn't a declaration or a promise, something in me warmed, not because I needed company, but because I needed to feel like I still belonged to the world. And maybe, just maybe, I still did. The days grew longer, and so did our conversations. There was no schedule, no formal rhythm to our visits. Some mornings, I would hear a gentle knock and find Walter standing there with 2 mugs of coffee. Other times, I would simply drift toward his porch around sunset, knowing without words that he'd be waiting. We shared little things, books we'd both read, memories that surfaced without warning. He told me about his years as a teacher, the ones that brought him the most joy. I told him about the garden I used to tend with my daughter before she moved away. Neither of us tried to impress the other. There was no need. It wasn't romance. Not exactly. It was presence, an exchange of breath and stillness, and the kind of honesty that doesn't rush. One afternoon, I brought over a box of old photos. I hadn't opened it in years. The pictures inside were faded. Birthdays, summer trips, awkward school portraits. Walter sat beside me on the floor as I sifted through them, my fingers trembling with the weight of remembering. He didn't ask many questions, just listened as I pointed and explained, sometimes laughing, sometimes going quiet mid-sentence. "That was my husband," I said, holding up a photo of us on a picnic blanket. maybe 30 years ago. We were younger than we realized. Walter studied it for a long time. "You look happy," he said. "We were," I replied. "Not always, but often enough." He nodded. "That matters." I left the box with him that day, not because I didn't want it, but because I trusted him with it. At evening, alone in my own house, I noticed how quiet it had become. Not the lonely kind of quiet, but the kind that holds space for thought. I sat in my armchair, knitting in my lap, the needles still. I wasn't thinking about the past or the future, just the moment. And then, somewhere between stitches, I realized I hadn't felt this alive in years. Not because of Walter, but because I had started letting myself be seen again. A week later, he invited me over for lunch. He had made soup, not from a can, he assured me proudly, but from scratch. It wasn't perfect, but it was warm, and the way he set the table, 2 cloth napkins, a small vase with a single daffodil, made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. After the meal, we sat in his living room, sunlight slanting across the carpet. He turned to me, more serious than usual. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," he said. I sat still. I haven't had anyone over in almost 2 years. Not even my children. I told myself it was easier that way, that keeping the world out meant I wouldn't be reminded of what I lost. He looked down at his hands. "But then you came over with banana bread, and I remembered what it felt like to be part of something again." I didn't respond. I just reached over and took his hand. And in that small gesture, everything was said. It still wasn't romance, but it was something very close to love. Something shifted after that afternoon. I started opening the curtains earlier, letting more light into the house. I found myself humming while making tea, reaching for music I hadn't listened to in years. Little things returned to me, like the way I used to tap my fingers on the countertop when I was thinking, or how I always added a little nutmeg to applesauce. Walter and I didn't see each other every day, but when we did, it felt like time paused, even just for an hour. One Saturday, I invited him over for lunch. I made egg salad the way my husband used to like it, served with crackers and pickles and a pitcher of lemonade that had just a touch too much sugar. Walter didn't seem to mind. We ate in the garden. It wasn't much, just a few rose bushes and some half-forgotten herbs, but I had pulled the weeds that morning, swept the stone path, and added a clean tablecloth to the iron bistro table. I hadn't done that for anyone in years. He noticed, not with compliments, but with presence. He looked around slowly, soaking it in like it meant something, and I think it did. We talked that afternoon about being forgotten, how the world tends to look past people like us, gray-haired, quiet, no longer in the thick of careers or raising families. We talked about how people stop asking questions, assuming there's nothing left to discover. "But there is," I said, surprising myself. He looked at me, and I knew he agreed. Later, as he helped me clear the plates, he paused with a dish in hand. "I used to think growing old meant shrinking, becoming smaller, but lately," he trailed off. "Lately?" I prompted. "Lately it feels more like unfolding." That stayed with me long after he left. That night, I stood in my bedroom, brushing my hair in the mirror. I caught my own eyes and held them for longer than usual. I saw the same lines, the same tiredness, but also something else. A softness, a quiet return. A few days later, I was sitting on my porch with a book when I heard Walter's voice from the sidewalk. "I'm going to the lake tomorrow. Thought you might want to come." I blinked, caught off guard. "The lake?" "Just a drive," he said, a hint of a smile. "You said you hadn't been in years." And I had. I remembered telling him about childhood picnics, about the way my father used to skip stones, about how the smell of pine and water always made me feel 10 years old again. "All right," I said. "I'd like that." It wasn't a date. It wasn't anything official. Just two people agreeing to share a little more of the road. That evening, I picked out an old scarf from the back of my drawer, the blue one with the tiny embroidered daisies. And when I held it to my cheek, because I could feel a part of me waking up, and she was someone I had missed for a very long time. The lake was quiet when we arrived. It was just past 10 in the morning, and a soft breeze stirred the leaves overhead. The sky was overcast in a gentle way, like the sun was still deciding whether to show up. Walter drove with the windows down, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping faintly against the door to the rhythm of a song I didn't recognize. We didn't speak much during the drive. It wasn't uncomfortable, just calm, easy. I watched the trees blur past the window and realized how long it had been since I had gone somewhere without a reason. He parked near the edge of the lake, where the grass gave way to a narrow stretch of pebbled sand. We each carried a small thermos, mine with tea, his with coffee, and a blanket folded under his arm. We sat close, but not too close, facing the water. The lake rippled in soft patterns. Birds drifted overhead. And for a long time, we just breathed. It felt like something sacred. Walter finally spoke. "This was where I brought her once, years ago, before the diagnosis. I didn't ask who. He didn't need to say it. She loved the quiet," he added. "Said it reminded her of the life she wanted to live, but never quite got to." I thought of my own quiet life, of how it had arrived slowly, like dusk, not with drama, but with small absences, empty chairs, fewer phone calls, weekends that felt like echoes of themselves. "Sometimes I wonder who I would have been if things had turned out differently," I said softly. He turned to me, but didn't speak, just listened, really listened. "I used to think it was too late to ask that question," I went on. "But lately, I don't know. Maybe there's still time." Walter nodded slowly. "I think the time we have left matters more than we think." We sat with those words. When we returned to the car, I noticed he still had the photo box I'd given him days earlier, tucked behind a seat. A small detail, but it meant something. He hadn't forgotten. That night, back at home, I stood by the kitchen sink, looking out into the yard. The sky had cleared. The stars were soft and scattered, like the kind I remembered from camping trips long ago. I reached for the radio, a dusty old thing on the shelf above the fridge, and turned it on. After a few seconds of static, a gentle tune began to play. Something old, familiar. And then, without meaning to, I stepped away from the sink and let the music take me. I didn't dance like I used to, but I moved, slowly, barefoot on the cool tile floor, arms loose, heart open. And in that moment, I felt younger than I had in years. Not because of the music, but because I was no longer waiting to be seen. I had started seeing myself again. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The following week unfolded in small, quiet ways. Walter didn't stop by every day, and I didn't expect him to, but there was a rhythm forming between us. A kind of unspoken understanding that we were both showing up, in our own time, in our own ways. One morning, I found a small note slip through my mail slot. "Made extra soup. If you're hungry, come by. W." There was no pressure, no insistence, just an offering. And somehow it meant more than grand gestures ever could. When I arrived, he had already set the table. 2 bowls, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. He looked up as I stepped in, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. It was a simple meal, But I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten something that felt so intentional, so shared. Afterward, we sat in his living room again, the afternoon light stretching long across the carpet. I asked him if he still played music. He hesitated, then pointed toward an old upright piano tucked into the corner. "Used to," he said. "She played more than I did. After she passed, I couldn't bear the sound. I looked at the keys. Dust had settled on them like a veil. "Maybe you should try again," I said gently. He didn't respond, not with words. But a few days later, as I was tending to my front garden, I heard faint music drift through the open window of his house. Just a few notes, hesitant and uneven, but they were music nonetheless. And they were enough. That same afternoon, I took out my sewing kit. It had been buried in the back of the closet, half forgotten. I had once made quilts for every season, each one stitched with memories and mistakes and pieces of old lives. I had stopped after Robert passed, telling myself there was no point in making something no one would ever ask for again. But now I threaded the needle and began anew. Not for someone else, not even for Walter. For me. In the evenings, I walked around the block. Not for exercise, but for breath, for air, for the chance to see the sky shift from gold to gray to deep blue. Sometimes I passed Walter on the sidewalk, returning from the market or walking just as slowly. We didn't always stop to talk. Sometimes just a glance, a nod, a smile. It was enough. One evening, we both found ourselves sitting on our porches at the same time. The air was warm, soft. Crickets had just begun their chorus. "Funny," he said across the lawn. "I used to think silence meant loneliness." I looked at him for a long moment. "Maybe it just means space," I said, "for whatever comes next." He smiled at that. Not the kind of smile you give to be polite. The kind you give when someone sees something inside you that you'd almost forgotten was there. I stayed outside long after the sun had disappeared, wrapped in a shawl and my own quiet thoughts. I wasn't waiting anymore, but I was open. And that, I realized, was its own kind of beginning. Autumn arrived slowly. The air turned crisper in the mornings. The leaves curled at the edges, and the light began to shift. Longer shadows, softer hues. I found myself wearing sweaters again, pulling the shawl tighter around my shoulders when I sat outside with my tea. Walter had started playing the piano more often, not every day and never loudly, but enough that I began to recognize the pieces. Old songs, mostly. Sometimes I would pause on my porch, letting the notes drift toward me like wind through trees. They were imperfect, but sincere, and always full of feeling. We didn't speak of everything. Some things remained quietly understood between us, like the way he watched the horizon when he thought I wasn't looking, or how I still traced my wedding ring tan line with my thumb when I was deep in thought. We were two people who had lost much, but not everything, and what remained was tender, even if unfinished. One afternoon, I invited Walter over for tea again. This time, I baked apple scones and placed them in a small basket, lined with an old embroidered cloth. The table was set for two, sunlight catching the edge of the teapot just right. He arrived a few minutes late, holding something behind his back. "What's that?" I asked. He smiled, a little shyly, and revealed a small photo frame. Inside was a picture of two sailboats on a lake at sunset. The brushstrokes were soft, watercolored, gentle. "I saw it at the market," he said. "It reminded me of that morning at the lake." I took it in my hands, my throat tightening. It was simple, but something about it caught me off guard. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We ate our scones in the usual way, quiet, thoughtful. with small smiles exchanged between bites. Afterward, we moved to the living room. I lit a candle on the mantel, the scent of cinnamon drifting softly through the room. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling leaves across the porch. Walter turned to me, more serious than I'd seen him in weeks. "Evelyn?" he began, then paused. "I know we haven't defined what this is, and maybe we don't need to. But I want you to know, whatever this has become for you, it's been important to me. More than I expected." I didn't answer right away. I just reached for his hand and held it gently. "Me too," I said. "It doesn't have to be more than it is, but it matters." He nodded, eyes soft, and we sat like that for a long time. Eventually, he stood to leave. At the door, he turned. "I'll be away for a little while," he said. "Visiting my son up north. But I'll be back before the frost." I smiled. "I'll keep the tea warm." After he left, I placed the photo by the window where the light touched it most of the day. Then I stood still, breathing, feeling alive. Not waiting, but ready. And that, I knew, was enough. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write to the bell, and share your impressions of listening to this story in the comments. Thank you for watching.